The purpose of this presentation is twofold. It's one, really spawning from the work that David and his team have done around the energy vision for 2030 and trying to achieve €60 per megawatt hour LCOE. And what will come of that, we as members of the Energy Committee, and I lead the LCOE working group, have to understand, well, what are the factors, both from a policy perspective and a regulatory perspective, that inhibit or would enable us to get there by 2030. And the second part of the presentation, I'm going to just dig into some of the auction clearing prices that we've seen around Europe for onshore, offshore and solar, and just looking at the pricing delta between the LCOE in those markets and the clearing price itself. Before I do, I'll just jump in to give you a whistle-stop tour of NTR. So NTR, we're 40 years in business, essentially this year. We've invested €3 billion, mostly in the US and Europe since then, which is a staggering achievement for an Irish company, reasonably small in size, based in Sadlier in Dublin. We were the largest owner-investor of toll roads in Ireland, the fourth largest ethanol producer in the US, developed 600 megawatts of solar in the US. We were Europe's largest wastewater treatment facility, the largest private recycler of waste in the US, UK and Ireland. And we've developed, both through our platforms and other platforms, including electricity, etc., Wind Capital Group in the US, 1.8 gigawatts of onshore wind, mainly in the last probably 12 years. In 2015, we took a strategic decision to essentially pivot away from a platform investor into a fund model. So we seeded our first fund with 4 investors, ISIF, Legal and General, ourselves as NTR, because it's important to have skin in the game in terms of the equity participation, and Strathclyde Pension Fund. That fund is now fully invested with 225 megawatts of assets in the UK and Ireland. We acquired all those assets pre-construction, took them through procurement financing into operations. We're now at a point where we are closing, hopefully in the next week or two, our second fund. So it'll be double the equity size, it'll be €500 million. We'll invest into onshore wind again, broaden into solar PV and energy storage on a co-location basis. We broaden our jurisdictional coverage to extend beyond Ireland and the UK into France, the Nordics and Italy. So that is us in a nutshell. Just a little bit about me. So I'm 15 years in the industry, 5 years in project finance starting off, 5 years in greenfield development focusing on wind and solar in the UK, Iberia and Ireland, and then last 5 years in private equity investment management focusing on Ireland, France, UK and the Nordics. My engineering colleagues are terrified that I think I'll move into an engineering role for the next 5 years, but I promise them I won't. So what are we doing at NTR at the moment? So out of our €500 million second fund, that'll be a levered fund, so enterprise value about €1.2 billion, of which the equity tranche will be 50 million focusing on development capital. So if you are a developer, I cover the Irish market, but if you are a developer looking to de-risk your position and bid into the auctions with a partner, let's have a chat later on today. We bring assets all the way from development through procurement, through financing into operations, and we own the assets for 30 years. But back to the purpose of the presentation. So Res LCOE and beyond. So as I said at the start, falling out of the energy vision, we're trying to achieve a €60 per megawatt hour LCOE by 2030. We are probably, I would say, halfway through our work at the moment, trying to understand what are the drivers, and the people involved within that subset of the Energy Committee and the working group is myself. It's Gary from Vestas, Margaret from Brookfield, Felicity Jones from Everose, David and his team in IWEA, Donald from Ellen Power, and Paul from ABO. And it's been a really interesting journey, because this isn't any focus into people's IP, because the LCOE fundamentally looks at cost and energy production. It doesn't look into financing or your procurement strategy or specific site optimization. So no one's given away IP. So it's been quite a collaborative journey in terms of what people are sharing in terms of their experiences in the Irish market, and further afield in terms of trying to drill that into the Irish market, for example, the UK or France. We have concluded, I'd say, the first wave of our analysis, which I'll present to you today. I think we'll try and round out the other parts of it, which are wholly focused on grid. So Margaret from Brookfield has done some great work on grid in terms of reforming, or concepts around reforming the network charges. and Paul from ABBA is doing a lot of work into curtailment compensation. So ultimately, by the back end of this year, we should have a reasonably coherent policy ask, which David and his team need to go to the relevant departments to present, and the actual the findings are quite stark. So just before we dig into the LCOE in Ireland, I think it's important to just look at where are we in the cycle of capex per megawatt in wind globally and where we've come across the last 25 years. So you can see there what this graph maps. It maps across the onshore wind capex per megawatt. So you can see clearly the trend down from 1985 to just over $1 million a megawatt today. This data set is from Bloomberg, and they're kind of modeling out 26% LCOE reduction between now and 2025, which is, on a global basis, which should be easily deliverable. And then if we just turn to our specific work on the Energy Committee, it's important to understand what the LCOE is. We haven't, as an industry in Ireland, had to focus on LCOE because refit for its success to get us to, I think, probably 3.8 gigawatts out-term by the back end of 2020. We haven't had to focus wholly on cost. Transitioning now where we are into the auction regime changes that, and I think it is an exciting time for the industry to start to focus on cost from a bottom up. So quite simply, what is the LCOE? The LCOE is your DevEx, CapEx and OpEx discounted to today, divided by the energy price over a project life cycle discounted to today. What it's not the auction clearing price, and it's not refit. Okay. And why do we use it? Well, we use it because it allows us to compare different technologies in different jurisdictions, looking at different asset lives, different input costs, and different risk-return profiles of each technology. Where we are in our analysis is that what we decided to do was understand what the LCOE is today. And I'll explain the 2015-2017 anomaly in a minute. What we decided to do is take an average wind farm in Ireland. So took a 25-year project life, 20 megawatt project, 2 megawatt platform size, 10 turbines, rotor diameter of 90 meters, tips of 126, net energy production of 33% capacity factors, probably a bit high, looking back over the last couple of years, or 10 years per se on average, and we've accounted for around a 3.5% to 4% curtailment constraint in that net energy production number, and we allowed for a 96.7% turbine availability net of unscheduled maintenance. DevEx, we modelled 1.1 million across a 5-year life cycle for planning. I think Donal and Element is very close to this, and we all know that 5 years for planning consent is very ambitious, so it's probably a bit longer than that. Turbine costs, so kind of 900 grand a megawatt, and then on the OpEx side of it, ratcheting up 6, 9, 12 euros per megawatt hour on 5-year blocks, extending to 15 at the back. And then we applied different discount rates for the risk at different parts of the project life cycle. So we said, WACC at 20% for the development phase, given all the inherent risk that brings today with judicial reviews, etc. A WACC at 10% during construction, and a WACC of 9% during ops. And what also was in our analysis, because you threat getting into the averages, but we took an average wind farm and a grid cost around 5.5 million euros, transmission and O&M charges around 40 grand per year. CLAF we took slightly less than Unity, which would probably be representative of most wind farms in Ireland. And we said, okay, well, what's that number? What's the LCOE in 2015? And it's important to point out that we took 2015 because in 2015 we didn't have ISM additional charges. In 2015 we didn't have increase in rates, and we didn't have the forthcoming community contributions, which we'll come to. So you dial all that into our model, and the LCOE comes out at €77 per megawatt hour, so which is quite high for a high wind resource country. So, and what does that mean? So, okay, €77 per megawatt hour. What are our neighbouring countries' LCOE? So we took France as an example in terms of a reasonably stable regime. So the French LCOE measured by Pori in about 2017 was €76 per megawatt hour. So we're not that far away. But then add in rates. So what we did was in our 2015 model, we took the old tonal list and an ARV of around €68, and then we transitioned that into the revaluation model through receipts and expenditure basis, and we applied an ARV which is the same as the Limerick case, accounting for the outcome of the tribunal at Brookfield and in ESB, which changed the split between the tenant and the landlord. So that brings the LCOE up from 77 to 81. Then we added on the refit imbalance cost, which is essentially changing rules of refit. And what we've dialed in there is around $350 purely for imbalance, which is probably a fair reflection of the average of the market. And then what we dialed in was the res community benefit. And I think it's important to show it. You know, the industry, and it's something that came across quite strong through the energy committees, is we all embrace community in wind energy development, etc., and the operation of the projects, but it has a cost. So on a normalised basis, yeah, we're the same as France, but we've just added another €9 per megawatt hour to the LCOE through socialised costs. And you dial out of the 77 at the top the impact of a high grid cost. We were doing business in France. The grid cost is substantially cheaper than it is in Ireland. So grid accounts for about €4 to €5 per megawatt hour on an LCOE basis, which is pretty high. So, you know, the analysis is, you know, it's slightly disheartening because of the increase in the socialisation of the costs. As an industry, we're all working to reduce the cost, and ultimately, you know, what has hit the industry since 2015 is cost additionality, and ultimately that comes back to the consumer through the PSO. So there is a strategic decision here, I think, that the government's going to have to make, looking at this analysis when it's presented to them, to say, listen, you know, this is the cost of wind energy in Ireland, which is substantially higher than other European markets, and if we're trying to get back to, you know, low cost, which we've proven through modelling at €60 per megawatt hour, well, we've just added another €9 per megawatt hour onto the LCOE over the last couple of years. So, but it's not all bad news. So what we did was, this histogram sets out our analysis, I guess. So the first four columns on the left we've already been through. We took 2017, so 77, added on local authority rates brings us up to 81, adding the refit and balance cost brings us to 84.2, adding res community benefit brings us up to 85.9. Okay, so that's where it starts to turn. So we start to look at various factors in terms of, okay, if that's our baseline, let's call it 86. What are the factors that get us to 60, or how can we get to 60? And one of the first things we looked at, it's pretty much a low-lying fruit, it's the qualifying cost of grid for capital allowances. So currently at the moment, we hand back the assets to the DNO or the TSO. The project company fully pays for that asset, but doesn't benefit from the actual capital allowances from a tax perspective. But what it does is reduce the effective tax rate from a 12.5% corporation tax to probably 10%. And in any other market, a 1% or €1 per megawatt hour LCOE reduction is quite a positive thing. So that is a low-lying fruit which can easily be addressed. And then the big one is the latest turbine technology, which is pretty obvious. So what we said was, okay, so if we're going to consider LCOE reduction, one of the main things that can get us there, and it is bigger machines. That's just, it's fact. So we flipped the 20 megawatt project into a 40 megawatt project, preserving the same array size in terms of 10 turbines, and we modelled out 30 years because there is type certification at the moment for 30 years, so you can rely on that. We increased the platform size from 2 to 4 megawatts in generator size, and we increased the rotor diameter from 90 to 136, and the tips went from 126 to 158, and we reduced the capex down from 900 to 750. That gets us to a 67 euro per megawatt hour LCOE, which is pretty substantial. That's grand. The model works. But what industry needs to communicate to government is the ability to do that. And the WEGs, as they're currently drafted, restricts or may restrict the ability for industry to reduce the cost of wind. I think the industry is going through a transition in terms of the integration of the asset into the community, which is positive. But if we're looking to reduce the LCOE from 85 to 60, it's got to be through bigger turbines on site, and the setback noise interpretation that's there at the moment may restrict that ability to deploy bigger turbines onto sites. And then we asked Gary Investors, could you knock another 100 grand off your capex price? And he said no, and we said we'll lash it into the model anyway. And that reduced the LCOE from 67 to 64. And then we said, Gary, can you knock another 20% off your OPEX? And he said, I can't. I said, well, lash it in anyway. And that reduces it to 62. But I think the key message here is that, if you look across the histogram, moving from 85 to 62, it's all within the OEM's gift. And that's just fact to some extent. But they need to have the policy there to allow bigger turbines to get to site. And then what we moved on from the turbine piece of the equation, and we looked at, well, what else helps? And that's where we start to get to sub 60 euros per megawatt hour LCOE, which is the yellow line, the orange line. And we looked at was, what would increased certainty in your investment case result in? So what are the key factors there at the moment? Well, if we had a 20-year CFD, which is the same as they have in France, well then, you can account for that in a lower discount rate because you have higher certainty in your cash flows. But the other thing that's been bouncing around in the Irish cash flows the last couple of years is that, there has been a significant increase in things like TUAS, adjustments to the CLAF, and with those factors moving around, and we've already covered rates, and the imbalance cost, which may or may not be higher because under RES it'll be marked the day ahead as opposed to the 80-20 split. You take all that uncertainty out of the cash flows, well then, equity and debt should be able to take a better position in terms of their investment case. So we said, listen, you knock 1% off your operational WACC from 9 to 8, and you get to 59. And then what we looked at was repowering the site. So Emma made a very good point earlier on that there's a significant amount of capital expenditure which goes into the network, and that provides an asset life of 25 years. But assets can go beyond that through repowering. And France have done something really interesting only in the last 2 months. They've brought in a piece of legislation which preserves the ability to repower a site. So they have constraints on it. So you have to stay within the same envelope. Number of turbines can't change. The nameplate can't exceed 20 megawatts, but there is room to optimize the site. And you've already paid for all your grid infrastructure, so why can't we do something similar here? It should be in the interest of policymakers to try and sweat those assets as much as they can. So then that brings us to 57.1, and Energy Committee's job is done, David, at that point in time. But I think that's really interesting analysis, because, as I said at the start, something we haven't had to look at in terms of the LCOE, and they are the drivers. We had to look at a lot more, but we had to look at an efficient planning process. Well, it makes sense. It reduces the risk on the WACC, but unfortunately, from an LCOE perspective, that DevEx piece doesn't actually really move the dial from an LCOE perspective. And then what we looked at was the auction prices in the context of LCOE. And I accept James's point that it's difficult to determine where the auction prices might clear. But let's look at a couple of examples. So you have offshore, onshore, and solar here. You can see that in the legend at the bottom. And it's odd to see the blue, Denmark, Holland, Germany, offshore clearing at the levels they have. as I say at the top of the slide, we need to compare apples with apples. A lot of the dev risk in those offshore platforms is removed. The grid cost is about 30% less than it is in Ireland, so it's not fair to compare like with like. Germany's gone through a bit of a trough in terms of the auction clearing price for wind in the last couple of years. It's floored and then it's come back up because essentially the community piece of the investment was being gamed by some of the local companies, and that had an impact on project delivery. But if we look at France, which is kind of on the right, so the first French wind auction cleared, 20-year CFD, 30% of the CFD index linked to inflation. We're all assuming that the Irish CFD will be 100%. And that cleared on a bid as clear basis, bid as pay basis at around 65. Okay, so we're talking about the onshore wind LCOE in France been 76 and it's clearing at 65. Well, you can have a sense of the differential. But what does that mean for Ireland? If we're saying, okay, well, if we're going to apply the same concept in terms of the delta between the auction clearing price and the LCOE in Ireland, if we're starting at an LCOE in Ireland of 60 or 86 and the auction clears at 77, being 11 euros per megawatt hour difference, well, that's not a great result for the consumer because it's pretty much the same as the REFA reference price. So there are clear things that if the government wants a successful auction, they need to enable lower LCOE through policy, and that's pretty clear. And then the last slide is like drawing a line in the sand, moving away from cost. So we're going through a transition at the moment where everyone's focusing on the LCOE, which is great because we're all into auction mode. David will take, when we've rounded out our analysis on the Energy Committee, he'll take that findings to support the energy vision to policymakers to show them the impact of it, which I think is quite important. If we're saying €6 per megawatt hour is a net nil cost to consumer, we need to get there. But as an industry, we need to move away from just cost. And the LCOE doesn't take into account revenue. So, the really interesting things that we're doing at the moment on the DS3 side of technology with turbine technology, what certainty in the future will there be for a single technology pot for wind? There is references in the RES high-level design that will be capped out at anywhere between 45 and 75. You need more certainty as a developer because you're looking at, we said 5 years for development. Everyone knows it's going to be longer. How can synthetic offtakes help us? We're active in the Nordics. We're looking at a lot of hybrid type of utility PPAs which begin to really work. And ultimately that's where the industry is getting to. One thing we've done is dig into the Iberian subsidy-free models to understand how their OPEX works, because OPEX really in wind farms, there should be very little of that that's fixed. It should be variable cost. So there is really interesting things happening in Iberia at the moment because they're all moving to a subsidy-free market in terms of how asset management, etc., has been priced. And then the last one is how can we, with our trading partners, better manage the imbalance risk. And I think that's going to be a challenge based on the type of information IWEA was presented, albeit short time frame. But we move into RES, well, the day ahead price is the reference price, and then you're wholly reliant on balance responsibility, and that is a big challenge to overcome. So that is it.